Hello and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center in Federal Highway Administration's Office of Pedestrian Safety Action Plan webinar series. Today is the fifth webinar of this 7-part series. Today's webinar is entitled Safety Enforcement with Peter Flucke, President of PBIC, etc. My name is David Anderson and I'm the PBIC Communications Coordinator. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. I'd first like to say hello to today's speaker and make sure he's ready and everyone can hear him. Peter, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good afternoon.
Attendees, if you can hear me and if you can hear Peter, click the hand in the box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to raise your hand so that we can be sure our audience can hear us. Okay, great. It looks like hands are being raised, so we'll go ahead and move forward. Before we get started with today's webinar, I want to go over a few administrative details and the functionality of the webinar software. If for some reason your computer or web browser freezes during the webinar, please reload the website and log back into the program. You'll be able to rejoin the session. Please note attendees will not be able to speak during this webinar. We do expect a large number of attendees on this call, so by muting your audio, it helps us to cut down on confusion and background noise. As an attendee, you have a control box in the upper right corner of your screen that collapses and expands by clicking the double arrow. Though you won't be able to speak, you will have the ability to ask questions by entering them in the question box. If you have a problem during the webinar, you may enter it here. I'll monitor these questions and respond to you if I'm able. Questions pertaining to the presentation may be asked at any time in the question box, but will not be addressed until the end of the program when we have built in about 20 minutes for a discussion period. Please feel free to ask those questions as we go along, and we'll get to them after the presentation. Also, when you exit the webinar, there's a very brief survey that will pop up. We would very much appreciate your feedback on our performance. Following today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email. This email will be sent 1 to 2 days after the presentation and will include a link to download a printable certificate of attendance for 1.5 hours of instruction. If there are multiple attendees at your site, please forward this link to other participants so that they can download and print the certificate with their name. This webinar has been submitted to AICP for 1.5 CM credits, but not yet approved. We will notify you by email if and when this has been approved. The Road Safety Academy, the training and education arm of the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, is a registered provider of CM credits. For more information on the Road Safety Academy, please visit www.rsa.unc.edu. Before we get started with today's program, I want to give everyone a little information about this webinar series. The goal of the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan webinar series is intended to help communities address pedestrian safety issues and initiate the steps to drafting a tailored pedestrian safety action plan. Modeled after the Federal Highway Administration and PBIC's in-person training course, How to Develop a Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, this free webinar series will cover topics ranging from funding to safety enforcement. The next webinar in the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan series is scheduled for Thursday, July 1st, 2011 at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. This webinar is entitled Engineering Strategies and will be presented by Hillary Illibrand, Federal Highway Administration Resource Center Safety Specialist, and Michael Moore, Principal Transportation Engineer with Nelson Nygaard, Consultant Associate. Please visit www.walkinginfo.org/webinars to register for this webinar and future ones in the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan series. The 7-part series was developed by the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, a national clearinghouse of pedestrian and bicycle-related safety information and resources. We offer information and technical assistance to diverse audiences about health and safety, engineering, advocacy, education, enforcement, access, and mobility as it relates to pedestrians and bicyclists. Today's webinar is made possible with funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Today's session will be archived and available for download on our website at www.walkinginfo.org/webinars. In addition to these webinars, PBIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at walkinginfo.org/training. Now I'm going to turn over the screen to Peter for the feature presentation, Safety Enforcement. While he's getting set up with his slide presentation, I want to take a quick poll from the audience. Please let us know how many participants are viewing the webinar from your site. I'm going to give everyone just a few more seconds to post their response. I'd like to welcome and thank Peter for his presentation today. We will take questions at the end. Peter, please take it from here.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for spending part of your afternoon with me so that I can talk to you a little bit about enforcement strategies. Just real quick by way of background, I was a Minnesota police officer for about 7 years, and I was a bike cop for 5 of those. So as well as being a pedestrian and bicycle advocate, I also have a law enforcement background. The learning objectives for this webinar. At the end of this module, you should be able to describe what and how to integrate enforcement strategies in your Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. So that's what we're shooting for here today. The subjects that we're going to cover are the role of law enforcement, the role of the law enforcement officer, dangerous behaviors, and enforcement strategies. Probably the first thing that we need to talk about here a little bit is where, law enforcement fits in. And those of you that are familiar with the highway safety triangle, when we're looking at any type of safety situation, we usually have to look at the 3 areas of education, enforcement, and engineering. The way that I look at it is that the built environment is really where we start. If we don't have safe facilities for people to, walk, bike, drive on, we're going to have difficulty in all the other areas. But we also need to not take for granted that we need to teach people how to use these facilities appropriately. But for better or worse, even when we build the best facilities we can, even when we teach everybody how to use it, we're almost always going to have a certain percentage of the population that chooses not to abide or follow the rules, the law of society, and those make it difficult and dangerous for the rest of us to operate. So enforcement is always going to be a key component of creating a safe and enjoyable system. The 4 E's all need to work together. Without them supporting each other, we're never going to come up with the best possible solution. So what is the role of enforcement? It's important for enforcement to be a part of this because they have the ability to increase awareness about pedestrian safety issues. Just simply knowing that the law enforcement personnel in your community care about pedestrian safety sends a very strong message. When you know that law enforcement cares about pedestrian safety, it tends to have an effect on improving behavior. There are several reasons why people change their behavior or do certain activities. Some folks do it just because it's safer and the right thing to do. Some people do it because it's courteous and they want to be perceived as, good members of society. But there are, some individuals that unless there's a threat of enforcement out there, they're not maybe going to pay as much attention as they could and change their behavior. So enforcement fits in there too. When we've got law enforcement out there, their role is to reduce traffic safety problems. That's one of the reasons that we have law enforcement in our society. It's important for folks to understand that when we talk about law enforcement, we train law enforcement, it's really more important that they're visible and a lot less important that they're issuing tickets. When I was trained as an officer early on, somebody told me, hey, we really want to use the lowest level of enforcement possible to get the change in behavior that we're looking for. So if we can do that with simple law enforcement presence, or with a friendly word or a written warning, we're going to definitely try those things before we issue the ticket. Some more things, the role of law enforcement officers or teachers. Just simply the presence and the acknowledgement of a law enforcement officer about activities that are going on sends a strong message, but sometimes officers are directly involved in teaching. We have a slide here where an officer is giving a presentation and is obviously actively enrolled in teaching the behaviors that we're trying to encourage. We often have officers go out and evaluate traffic concerns. When a neighborhood feels that speed is too high, very typically the complaint will go to the law enforcement agency, and they'll assign an officer to go out there and observe what's going on so that they can decide what the best action is going to be to move forward. Again, I mentioned before that providing a police presence has a strong effect on how people behave in the community. If you have an area where people are speeding, where it's not safe to cross the street, simply interjecting police presence into that environment will often make a difference. Police are out there all the time monitoring drivers and pedestrians' behavior, watching what they're doing, seeing how things are going, and there's always the possibility of interacting, again, like I said, at those different levels of simply their presence, the oral warning, written warning, and a ticket, but very seldom is a ticket the best way to go. There are a number of different law enforcement officers. I chuckled a little bit when I first saw this slide. The first department that I worked at had 15 law enforcement officers. We didn't have the option of splitting into specialties. We were all specialists in whatever need presented itself at the moment. 1 minute I might be working traffic, the next minute I might be doing fingerprints at a crime scene. So the smaller departments typically have individual officers covering all of these different roles and tasks. But as we get larger, as we're able to specialize, or as special needs come up, we have special officers that deal with special things. Motor officers or officers driving squad cars or possibly motorcycles may be out doing certain tasks. For some departments, that may be strictly traffic or strictly responding to certain types of calls. We have community action officers who deal with primary interactions with the community. How are things going? How can law enforcement be part of the solution to any issues that are out there? School resource officers have become very popular and very effective. I have 2 children, and they both know their school liaison officers on a first-name basis and have a very positive positive feeling about them. But we also know that when we have problems in and around the school, the officers are there to be the first line of defense in making sure that everybody's safe and following the law. We also have cops on special types of patrol duty, cops on bike. I was a police bike officer for 5 years. An amazing tool in terms of simply doing my job and not changing the environment that I entered unless I wanted to. But it also was just an amazing way to develop rapport with the citizens that I was working with. I've worked with officers on horse patrol, incredibly effective in large crowd situations, and we're starting to see the return of the beat cop officers that are out on foot. It draws a much stronger connection, I think, to our pedestrian community when it's the officers themselves that are out there walking in that environment and trying to cross the street. There are certain dangerous behaviors which it's important to key on. Law enforcement doesn't have the time or the resources to enforce every violation of the law that is related to pedestrian safety, and so consequently it's important for the officers to know which violations lead to the most crashes, the most fatalities and injuries, and also just a general sense of discomfort or fear that might be preventing some people from getting out and walking. Speeding is a big deal. People are afraid of cars that are driving too fast, and with good reason. We know that as the speed of motor vehicles increases, the risk of having a serious injury or a fatality increases. Bringing the speeds down, certainly within the speed limits and sometimes even lower, is important to create a safe and enjoyable pedestrian environment. Failure to yield. In the picture that we have up on the screen now, we have a pedestrian walking in a marked crosswalk, pretty well marked, and it's the place that we encourage pedestrians to cross the street. It's the place that we tell them that it's safe to do so. But if our motorists aren't following that same set of rules, it becomes very dangerous for the pedestrians. It also becomes very uncomfortable. And it's important that we enforce laws that deal with motorist failure to yield to pedestrians. Running red lights. We talked before about the 3 E's of engineering, education, and enforcement. An example that I often use is that there may not be anything wrong with the way that this intersection is engineered. It might be created as well as we can from a physical environment standpoint. I don't think there's much doubt that most of our citizens know that the red light means stop, and that the white crossing pedestrian signal means that it's time for pedestrians to cross. But if we have motorists that decide not to abide by those rules, it becomes incredibly dangerous. So red light running is a very important enforcement activity for law enforcement to be involved in. Passing stopped cars, the multiple threat type crash. Most, if not all, states have laws that require motorists in both lanes to stop and or yield to pedestrians in crosswalks. In the picture that we're looking at now, the car on the left has its brake lights on and is stopped. The pedestrian has passed that vehicle, but the next vehicle he's encountering does not have his brakes on and is going to continue through. This is an important place for us to use all of our bags of tricks: good engineering, advanced stop bars, educational efforts to let everybody know how this is supposed to work and where they should weigh in. And then lastly, enforcement being part of the scenario so that motorists that choose not to stop will be held accountable for that behavior. And certainly, passing stop school buses is an incredibly important activity for law enforcement to be involved in. We have laws that are created to protect our most vulnerable users in the traffic environment, the children who may not be able to completely comprehend or cope with the complexities of traffic. So we've created laws that require people driving cars to stop and yield to the stop school bus, and if they don't do that, it's not a good scenario or situation for our children. So law enforcement has to know and understand where they fit into helping our children move about safely. Distracted driving has been a hot topic now for a long time with the increase of cell phones and portable data devices, just our busy lives, all those things. Distracted driving is taking our attention away from the traffic environment, and that includes our pedestrians. Motorists are typically looking for other motor vehicles. Those are the main threat to them in the traffic environment. And when they're distracted, they tend to pay even less attention to our most vulnerable users, our pedestrians, and I'll include bicyclists in there as well. Distracted driving has always been something that law enforcement has keyed on even before the cell phones and the mobile data devices, but now I think it's even more important. It's not just our motorists that are contributing to the dangerous pedestrian environment we have. Typically, in order for a crash to occur, both parties, the pedestrian and the bicyclist, have to do something wrong. It may not necessarily be a violation of the law, but in this example where we have a pedestrian walking across the street against the light, obviously that's a violation of the law. But if the motorist is paying good attention to the traffic environment, he would realize that there was a pedestrian in the road and in the way, and hopefully take evasive action, and the crash still would not occur. So it's important that everybody, the pedestrians and the motorists, both follow the law, but also exercise, extra special care to make sure that they're not engaging somebody inappropriately. But disobeying signals, not a good thing for pedestrians. Not looking before you cross the street. I love this picture. In this example, you've got a pedestrian walking across what looks to be a 3-lane roadway. And when we're educating pedestrians about crossing the street, we tell them the best place to cross is going to be typically at an intersection where you have some control devices. But you always need to be looking constantly back and forth as you go across the street. Well, this woman is holding an umbrella, which prevents her from looking at least one direction while crossing the street. So it's important for pedestrians to be paying attention, judge their gaps properly, and look well before and while they're crossing. Crossing at undesirable locations is an issue. In this picture, looks like we have fairly heavy traffic, and if you look in the middle in front of the red car, you can see a pedestrian running across the street. I remember years ago a fellow officer telling me that whenever you see a pedestrian running across the street, something is not right. Pedestrians shouldn't have to run to get across the street. So there may be other issues at play here, but in terms of the pedestrian's behavior, it's important for pedestrians to cross at locations where they're predictable. It's important for them to make sure that there's a sufficient gap in traffic so the motorists aren't required to, abruptly stop or yield for them. So those are definitely things that pedestrians can do to improve the situation. So here's a question for all of you. When is enforcement effective? And often what I find is in the 3 areas of engineering, education, and enforcement, we like to assume all the responsibility for pedestrian safety in our one area of expertise. If it's engineers, we like to try to engineer out all the potential problems. As educators, we want to teach people to avoid all the situations that could be potentially dangerous to them. And for law enforcement, sometimes we want to, enforce every law or put in so much enforcement into place that nobody can get hurt. But the reality is that it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to solve our traffic safety problems in just one area. The time that law enforcement is most effective is when we have good engineering in place, when people are well educated, the motorists and the pedestrians, about safe behaviors. If we can get 85% of the people to comply and use the system properly, then law enforcement can be pretty effective in curbing the bad behavior of the remaining 15%. I'm going to back up just and finish one more thought. If the law enforcement is being required, or if they're being required to make up for more than 15%, if we have a straight, flat roadway that's 52 feet wide and, no curbs or anything, but we put up a 25-mile-an-hour sign, it's not particularly likely that we're going to get, 85% of the people to go 25 miles per hour. In that kind of a situation, we're really going to need some engineering intervention, curving the street, narrowing it down, road diet, adding vegetation, and some good education in order to make it more effective for law enforcement to get the rest of those folks to comply with that speed. So when is law enforcement effective? There's a 6-week concept. When we do enforcement activities to try to raise awareness and pull people closer to compliance with the law, if we run a pedestrian crosswalk activity, if we do a speed enforcement activity, what we found over the years is that when we do that and just use enforcement, that it actually can be effective. But if we do nothing else after about 6 weeks, the situation tends to head back towards where it was. And so what you end up doing if you just use law enforcement is you have this problem and you have to deal with it again, and you just keep going back and forth. Like I said earlier, we're really going to need to use engineering and education to change the situation. So what type of enforcement is not effective? Typically, ticketing jaywalkers is not effective. The next slide will show an example here. We have some elderly women who are crossing the street mid-block. If you look at the environment, there's a retail center on their left, and there's no crosswalk within eyeshot. So the question is, why are these women crossing here? Well, the bigger picture shows us that they parked on the other side of the street. Looks like there's limited parking possibly, and it's not an unreasonable behavior for people to park on one side of the street and walk across. As adults with experience in traffic with the low traffic volumes that seem to be occurring at this location, not necessarily all that unsafe or unreasonable. Plus, it would be very, very hard to use enforcement to get people to change their behavior here because the desire line is so strong. We might need an education or an engineering solution to try to improve this situation. When we're enforcing laws for pedestrian safety, you have to realize that there are lots of laws out there, and we discussed that before. We also discussed that there are certain laws which really need to be targeted because their violations contribute to the majority of the safety hazards that we have. It's important to review the laws that we have, to know what they are, and then to make an assessment on whether the laws that are in place are sufficient and simply need to be enforced better, or if there are changes to the law which would be necessary to improve situations. If you're looking at the law, there are some resources available. One of them is the NHTSA Resource Guide on laws related to pedestrian and bicycle safety. Vehicle and traffic law, it gives examples of vehicle and traffic laws from all over the country and laws that are not part of the Uniform Vehicle Code, the UVC. And it also presents some model legislation in case you feel that your laws maybe need some improving. An example of that would be some states require motorists to stop for pedestrians in crosswalk. Some are only require the motor vehicle to yield for pedestrians in crosswalk. And sometimes when we have a yield law that can send some mixed messages, stop law may be clearer and in some cases safer. A community approach to law enforcement is very helpful and really necessary. We just don't have enough police officers out there to take care of all of the problems. If we can get people by choice to follow the rules of the road and to abide by the laws on their own, it's going to be, again, much more effective, and we'll have to use law enforcement less often. So there's some examples here of solutions where community members can be part of the team, if you will, to make pedestrian safety work better. Neighborhood speed programs, speed watch programs would be an example. Using slow down yard signs, pace cars, neighborhood fight back programs, and adult school crossing guards are all examples, and I've got a few slides on those. The neighborhood speed watch program is a lot like a neighborhood watch program, but in this case what we do is provide citizens with radar units that they can use to help monitor speed. These tend to be pretty effective programs because instead of it being law enforcement versus the motorist, it tends to be fellow citizens that are out there making a judgment and an assessment about whether people are driving faster than they should be and whether they need law enforcement for assistance. And these programs, the citizens aren't stopping motorists. They're not even interacting with them. They're simply monitoring the situation and then feeding that information to law enforcement. It's a pretty effective program, and for the years that I worked radar, people tend to slow down when they see radar guns out there, and you know, citizen's car could look just like an unmarked squad car. Pretty effective program. There have been examples. Greensboro, North Carolina, Sacramento have used these programs effectively. I live in a suburb of Green Bay, Wisconsin, Ashwaubenon, and we have a citizens group that goes out regularly and uses the radar unit. Yard sign campaigns are pretty cool too. You know, people have a lot of things on their minds that they're thinking about. They're not always paying attention to pedestrian safety. So, you know, a reminder, a well-placed reminder can be very useful. So putting up signs like these that were used in a community: respect our neighborhood, drive responsibly, drive 25. Great cue to people to check their speedometer, see what kind of speed that they're at. I worked with the program in Madison, Wisconsin, and it was very effective. What we found was that if we just left the signs out there, that their effectiveness decreased over time. If we would group the signs but then have them out there for a limited period of time, then take them down and put them back, it was much more effective. Another community that I know of actually used their garbage cans as the billboards for their slow down signs. And the neat thing about that was that those garbage cans typically would go out there once a week. So once a week, all around the community, people would get a little reminder to slow down, and then the effect wouldn't wear off. There's also a neighborhood or a pace car campaign. This is a program where people take a pledge and they put a bumper sticker on their car, and the pledge says that they will drive the speed limit. They, in effect, become rolling speed blocks in their neighborhood. I tease my daughters, who think I drive way too slowly, that driving the speed limit, now that I'm not a cop, is my favorite act of civil obedience. The more cars you have driving the speed limit in your community, the harder it is for others to speed. Neighborhood fight back programs. If you have a group of residents that have identified a problem in the community, whether it's pedestrian safety or something else, when they band together and work together, we tend to come up with a much better, more comprehensive solution than if we just use law enforcement. When we have a neighborhood program, we can interject engineering, education, and enforcement solutions to the problem. These programs typically target things like crime, blight, and other negative issues in the community. Adult school crossing guards are a real plus. When you think about the ability of children to walk safely in most of the traffic environments that we've created, they're at a big disadvantage. Traffic is very, very complex, and children are just learning how to safely negotiate these situations. Where we have areas that are more complex than normal, or simply just complex enough to make it difficult for children to get to and from school, putting an adult crossing guard at those locations to send a strong message to motorists to be careful, to help the children get across the street, and to train the children about safe crossing behavior is a really good idea. It's very important, though, to train the crossing guards so they can be safe and as effective as possible. There are a number of approaches that we recommend for law enforcement. It's important for law enforcement to involve the community. We don't want them operating unilaterally, and it's just not effective. Law enforcement is there to protect and to serve the community. So working with the community, they can engage them in the process. The citizens will be much more knowledgeable about how the process works, and it'll be much more effective. Educating the public about what the capabilities of law enforcement are, some of the other things in terms of engineering and education that might help the situation are very important. It's important also to provide officer training. One of the things that I know after years of law enforcement and years of law enforcement training is this: I don't know a single law enforcement officer that got into police work to make the world a better place for pedestrians and bicyclists. And that puts us at a disadvantage. Typically, law enforcement officers don't receive any special training on pedestrian safety in recruit school or field training through their department. Without that type of training, it's difficult for them to take appropriate enforcement action, educate the public, or respond appropriately to the needs of the community. So it's important that law enforcement officers get special training. It's also important that they follow up with the community. When they engage, they're in effect making a promise to the community, and they need to follow through on that promise. Involving the community, you need to let the community know what it is that you're planning to do and ask for their feedback. This will gain you additional partners, which will help with the efficiency and effectiveness of your program. Raising the public awareness simply adds to your effectiveness. Let the public know what the process is, where they can engage, and what changes they're likely to see. Just simply raising the awareness may improve the behavior of some of the citizens that you're working with. Provide officer training, I talked about that. Another way to say it is cops don't enforce laws that they don't know, and they don't enforce laws that they can't defend. So if we're not educating police officers on, what hazards are out there for pedestrians, which violations of the law create the most dangerous situations, then we shouldn't be surprised if they're not doing what we want them to. But when we provide them with that training, cops are very good at being cops. They just need to be fine-tuned a little bit about pedestrian safety. We just need to get everybody on the same page. Again, follow-up is important after we initiate steps to improve a condition. We need to get back out there and make sure that it's really working. If it's not working the way we want it to, we need to tweak the approach and then check it again. I just love this picture. We've got two motor officers running radar, and they've got to be twins. Different methods that law enforcement can use to improve citizen compliance with the rules of the road. Speed trailers and speed monitoring devices are one example. A traffic complaint hotline has shown some effectiveness. Photo enforcement has been effective in some places. It's not always available. We're not allowed to use it here in the state of Wisconsin, for instance. But I was just in New Orleans, and they're using it there. Pedestrian decoy operations, and I'll explain that a little more. Progressive ticketing activities, and then increasing fines. All of these are methods that have been used by law enforcement and have proven to be effective. Speed trailers, simply a monitoring device to make the public aware of how fast they're going. Most of us drive based on conditions that we perceive, not necessarily on what the speed limit is, but the speed limit may be set to help us anticipate conditions that we may not be picking up on our own. Speed trailers do reduce speed, but remember that 6-week concept that we talked about. What we find is if you leave a speed board there for too long with no enforcement coupled with it, then we tend to get less and less compliance. So sometimes after we've had the speed board out for a while, we'll move on to running enforcement activities just down the road, and that tends to increase our compliance. There are also fixed monitoring devices, which can be very useful. Some of these devices and the speed trailers now allow us to collect data, and so we can, in the office, just evaluate when people are speeding, and that helps us decide when we might use our manpower best for enforcement purposes. This is just an example of a solar-powered unit, so installation is getting easier. Complaint hotlines are a great way for us to interact with the general public. Even as an ex-police officer, sometimes I flinch at whether or not I should be calling, my police department and letting them know about certain things. So the easier it is we can make it for citizens to give feedback about how they perceive their community to be working from a safety standpoint, the more likely we are to get good information to law enforcement so that they can engage. Photo enforcement, I mentioned it briefly. Where we do have it, we are seeing increase in compliance to red lights. So it's certainly an option worth looking at. I want to spend a little bit of time on the pedestrian decoy or the pedestrian enforcement action. I use this a lot when training police officers and trying to engage them in the safety of pedestrians in their environment. There's not a whole lot better way to engage police officers in pedestrian safety than to have them walk across the street in a marked crosswalk in their own city, even in uniform and fully armed. And when they find out that the motorist won't yield for them either, they quickly move through make the connection that if the motorists aren't stopping for a fully armed and uniformed police officer in the crosswalk, that they have a problem, and that maybe somebody should do something about that, and it probably is that police officer that should be doing something about the problem. So how do we do these? What we do is we set up a scenario where we can train police officers and the general public about the appropriate yielding or stopping behavior for motorists when there are pedestrians in crosswalks. First thing we need to do is identify the high-risk locations. Where are the problems occurring? The next thing that we want to do is let motorists know that we're going to be conducting these activities, that we're going to be out actively looking for motorists that aren't stopping for pedestrians in crosswalks. We're not trying to keep it a secret. We're trying to give people fair warning. From an enforcement standpoint, when you have signs up like this and the motorist doesn't stop for you in the crosswalk, the officers tend not to have a lot of sympathy, because if they didn't see the sign and they didn't see a officer in uniform, they're pretty sure that a normal citizen crossing the street would not have been seen either. So how do we do this? Officers are often reluctant to cite motorists for crosswalk violations because they feel like there's a big gray area. Was the motorist able to stop? Was this really a violation? So when we set these scenarios up, the first thing we do is we calculate the safe stopping distance at given speeds. At 35 miles an hour, the perception, reaction, and stopping time for a motorist is 161 feet. At 25 miles per hour, there's a significant decrease. It's only 73 feet. But when we know what this distance is, we can take away some of the vagaries, which make it more likely that the officers will engage in this process. What we'll do is, if we're working on a road that has a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit, we'll actually take and put a red cone along the side of the road or even on the lane line. And this is an indicator. This gives the officers the ability to judge if the motorist was outside of this safety buffer zone on the opposite side of the cone when the pedestrian stepped into the crosswalk. The motorist had ample time to stop or yield to the pedestrian, and if they don't, it's a violation of the law. So we get a couple of real positive things here. We take away the vagaries. The police officers are more likely to engage in the process, and it's an educational opportunity for the motorist. Here's an example of a vehicle not stopping for, this happens to be a police officer in plain clothes walking across the street. And there's an officer about to go talk to that motorist. We've seen very good compliance after these activities. Just a quick graph from Miami Beach, Florida, where this approach was used. When we start an activity like this, or any new pedestrian safety activity, progressive enforcement is definitely the way to go. We've had programs where we've decided that we want to improve pedestrian safety, or we want to improve bicycle safety. So we're just going to send police out there to enforce every pedestrian safety law that exists. And there's a couple of problems with that. The first problem is that you're just going to exhaust your police officers, and you're taking them away from other duties. It's not like they're sitting around with not enough to do. The other problem is that we tend to make the citizens who we're trying to get to comply, we make them really, really grumpy, and they tend to get mad at the police officers instead of thinking about what the behavior is that we're trying to change. So a progressive approach to enforcement seems to work much better. So if we're doing the pedestrian safety activity, we may choose for the first month, the first 2 months, 3 months, to simply give warnings to motorists for the violation. After that period, we may up the ante some, so now we'd be giving written warnings or oral violations, and ultimately we would have citations be part of that scenario. We tend to get much better compliance and appreciation from the general public when we enforce that way, and it just makes it easier. NHTSA had a program, Heed the Speed, which incorporated many of these different components. What we find is the more components we can put together in an enforcement program, the more likely we are to be successful. So in this particular situation, there was education that went out about speeding. We used yard signs, speed trailers. We used progressive ticketing, and then on a regular basis went back in and re-implemented those procedures. Much more comprehensive and a much more successful approach. Doubling the fines, raising the fines may be appropriate. Tends to get people's attention when they know that if they do certain behaviors that there's going to cost them a lot of money. People tend to respond to that. It's important, though, that the officers understand why they're doing that, because officers have the ability to enforce or not enforce based on their discretion. So if we double the fines and they think that's too high, it might actually result in less enforcement, but educated officers tend not to have those kinds of issues. Just some examples here where they used the increased fines in Bremerton, Washington. They got a 23% increase in compliance, and in Tumwater a 13%. Pretty good increase in compliance. Education enforcement should be part of your Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. They help you build partnerships, use the media more effectively, engage the community, helps with fundraising and other types of support, and it can help you measure the effectiveness. So it's important to have this be part of the plan. Building partnerships benefits because helps benefit you because there's strength in numbers, helps you get additional resources, expertise, and funding. Well-coordinated efforts use resources more effectively. Like we said before, if we can get 85% of the people complying with the law on their own, law enforcement, it can be pretty effective at that additional 15%. It also helps you identify potential obstacles and their solutions. Effective partnerships. Who do we want to have part of our team? Certainly the decision makers in your community, planners and engineers, educators, health professionals, the media, community representatives, law enforcement, transit officials. And these are just a few examples. The possibilities are almost endless. The media has to be one of your partners. You can only pull over and talk to or cite so many people, but when you can multiply the effect of your enforcement activities by publicizing them, letting the media know, letting the other citizens know, your effect is much, much, much broader. You get a public education component. It's better than ticketing. We've talked about that earlier. And it's important to get the information out before the campaign begins. We're not trying to surprise anybody here. We want them to voluntarily change their behavior. Ways to involve the media: you can hold press conferences, provide press packets, simply talk to the media, or publish articles in your local paper. All of those can be very effective. I think it's important for you to craft the message instead of the media. Hopefully you're the expert on the topic and they typically are not. So again, engaging the community, put information in community newsletters, emails to residents, use speed radar boards. We've talked about that. Post enforcement signs and yard signs. We've got an example of a newspaper clipping down here, just letting the public know that this is important and what we're working on. Finding funding and other support is important. That can be found at local, regional agency budgets, through local businesses, advocacy groups, and state and federal grants. It's important at the end to make sure that you measure the effectiveness. You want to be able to show that your program has met the objectives. Are fewer people getting injured or killed? Have we slowed down speed? Are we doing what we said we would do? It also helps you discover if there's a need. You need to tweak something. Do you need to change something? And it also justifies your current funding and maybe future funding, and it provides guidance for similar programs. I alluded to already different ways to measure the effectiveness of the program. And finally, there's a number of resources that are out there and available to us. There are resource guides on laws related to pedestrian and bicycle safety. There are bicycle and pedestrian resource guides, safe routes to school guides, adult crossing guard guides, and pretty much any of the issues or problems that you're dealing with, somebody else has dealt with you before, and I'm sure would be happy to help you out coming up with a solution to that problem. So in summary, the things that we're trying to work on here, law enforcement officers are valuable partners and can play many different roles in solving your problems. Enforcement includes many strategies to improve behavior. Enforcement works best when coupled with engineering, with education and engineering, and enforcement requires the support of the community. So hopefully by now you should be able to describe what and how to integrate enforcement strategies into your pedestrian safety action plan. And now I'll turn this back over to Davian to see if we have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We now have time for questions. If you have a question, please enter it into the question box. Again, if we do not get to your question, we will attempt to post these questions after the program. Okay, Peter, I'm going to move into the first question. The first question asks, how are officers trained to carry out community action and school resource duties?
Davian, could you repeat that, please?
Absolutely, and I apologize for the audio issue. How are officers trained to carry out community action and school resource duties?
You know, there's a wide variety. You know, I've worked with departments that have, you know, thousands of officers, and, you know, I've been on departments that have 15. There's formalized training and then just training that happens kind of on a day-to-day basis. You know, if you happen to be in a department where they're actively engaged in, you know, community activities already, they tend to pick up on those. But often there isn't a lot of training, to be honest, about those things until citizens, advocacy groups engage and ask for officers to be part of that solution. And then it's usually officers or departments going out and checking many of the resources that I just referred to and picking up additional training so that they can be part of that solution. That's why it's important for advocacy groups to know what those resources are, because they may actually know more about pedestrian safety than law enforcement does.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Moving to the next question. The next question asks, how could enforcement work with an activity that is actually legal? And the example given is crossing mid-block when there are no nearby signalized intersections.
Exactly. You know, it's important to think about who in the highway safety triangle can do what. The one thing that law enforcement can do that nobody else can do is enforce laws. And so I'm always trying to remind people that it's important to use our resources where we have them best. But that doesn't mean that if you have a legal activity like crossing mid-block that law enforcement can't be a very valuable partner in improving people's safety. The issue here is not to stop people from crossing mid-block, but to help them understand, how crashes happen and what types of things they need to pay attention to. So if we have a law enforcement department leading the effort on that, it's really purely an educational effort, and that's talking about, being able to judge gaps in traffic, the difference between adults and children, all those kinds of things. These are messages that can come from the education community or the advocacy community, but when you have a law enforcement officer with the instant credibility that cops tend to carry, being part of that message delivery system, I think it can be much more effective.
Thank you, Peter. You touched on this a little in your presentation, but could you talk a little bit more about some successes that you've seen with speed trailers?
Yeah, the speed trailers are kind of a neat thing. I mean, we don't have enough police officers to be monitoring every, mile of every road in a given community. So we need to pick and choose where law enforcement is, or where we're going to deploy those resources. But we also need to try to see if we can raise compliance for speed limits when law enforcement isn't around. And I can't remember if I mentioned this before, but I think it's important to think about why people behave the way they do. Some people will do it because it's safer. So those people are probably driving the speed limit anyhow. Some people will do it because it's courteous, which means that if they think that they're interfering with somebody or scaring somebody, they may choose to slow down on their own. But the last one is because there's that threat of enforcement. When we put up those speed trailers, I mean, most folks figure out pretty quickly that that it's not their neighbor putting up the speed trailer, that it's law enforcement, and that they're doing it intentionally to get people to slow down. So, simply the presence of the speed board will gain some compliance in getting folks to slow down. But if we really want to maximize the effectiveness of those speed trailers, the way that we do it in one of the communities that I worked at is we would put that speed trailer out there for a couple of 3 days with no enforcement associated with it at all. But then after about the third day, then we would simply move down the road about a mile, and there's something called the halo effect where people are, complying with the speed limit because they're concerned about enforcement, but that wears off after about a mile or so, and then they tend to pick up their speed again. So after, outside of that distance, then we would have an officer there with a radar unit that would then, pull people over, and the discussion about I didn't know what the speed limit was kind of goes away, and, we're able to move on to other educational efforts. So that's kind of one of the ways that we've maximized the use of that speed board. And then I mentioned also in the presentation that speed boards sometimes now can collect data which tells us, where and when might be the best time to deploy our law enforcement officers.
Thank you, Peter. We'll move into the next question. What are the elements of a good crossing guard training? What communities are models?
I believe the state of Florida actually has a very good program, and if you think about it, the information that the crossing guards need to have is the same information that our children need to have. It's the same information that our adults and our parents need to have, and our motorists and law enforcement. We talked in one of the slides about making sure that everybody was on the same page. We would expect our law enforcement officers probably to have the highest degree of training and experience in that area, but we need and want to have our crossing guards have very high levels of training as well. And some of the things that come to mind for me is that pedestrian crashes are predictable. We know what types of pedestrian behaviors and what types of motorist behaviors lead to most of our crashes. We typically know what time of day they occur, what day of the week, what behaviors for pedestrians and bicyclists. And all of that information is important for our crossing guards to know. They need I have a black belt in karate, and I asked my instructor one time, I said, how come you keep telling me all this stuff? And he looked at me and smiled and said, so you know when to duck. If you're going to put a crossing guard out in the middle of a dangerous intersection and ask them to help protect our children, they need to know some of the mental and physical developmental issues that children have, which make them more susceptible to crashes. They need to know what the common errors are for pedestrians and motorists so that they can teach children about those things, but also help protect them from the immediate threat.
Thank you, Peter. The next question asks, what is the most effective way to ensure safety of school kids on bikes in downtown and adjoining urban areas? Do you find that motorists need more education than bicyclists or vice versa?
Well, I think I was talking before in the dangerous behavior section about how there are, things that motorists do which are dangerous and often illegal. There are things that pedestrians and bicyclists do which are, dangerous and often illegal. And, we need to raise the education level of all of those groups. So I would not even venture to put it on one group more than the other, because like I said before, is if the motorist makes a mistake, but the pedestrian has the ability to anticipate that mistake and put themselves in a safer location, that's a good thing for everybody, and vice versa. So I really think that it's that three-pronged approach that we always talk about. We need to build the best facilities that we possibly can so that pedestrians and motorists and bicyclists can coexist. But then we need to teach everybody how to use them safely, and that education would include, how mistakes occur, which can lead to problems. And then law enforcement needs to be part of that triad to help round out those rough edges for those folks that choose not to comply with the law.
Thank you, Peter. The next question asks, you mentioned the use of roadside cones or markers to let the officer know where a driver should be able to yield. Do you know, or I'm sorry, I think there's a need to provide similar information to pedestrians so they know when it is not safe to cross. Do you know of anyone that is providing this type of information to pedestrians?
That's a great question, because it's kind of just recently dawned on me that, if we have our law enforcement officers not knowing, what the perception reaction time is at a given speed for a pedestrian to safely cross or a motorist to safely yield or stop to a pedestrian, it's probably equally as important that our pedestrians know that. One of the things that we know about the development of children is that they have difficulty at young ages with the perception of speed and distance. They may not walk or enter the street when there's plenty of room, and conversely, if there's not enough room, they may erroneously try to run through that gap. We have the same trouble with intoxicated pedestrians. Obviously, they're difficult to educate. But I think training with children that helps them assess those gaps in traffic and helps them assess, where and when it's safe and more safe and less safe to cross would be very valuable. I have not seen a program like that. I wouldn't be surprised if it's out there, but if it's not, it might be something I'm working on soon.
Great. The next question asks, how do you approach helmet laws?
Yeah, helmet laws are an interesting thing, and I've got probably 20 or 30 years of experience dealing with this kind of stuff. I'm a commuter. I'm a recreational rider, and I do some road racing. As a matter of fact, I'm taking off tomorrow to bike around the state with my wife on our tandem. I don't ever, period, ride my bike without a helmet. Having said that, in the state of Wisconsin, it's not illegal for you to do that. There are a couple of different levels that I think we need to engage the helmet issue in. As many of you know, helmets make crashes safer. They don't keep you out of crashes. If I've only got one thing that I can talk to somebody about in terms of bicycle safety, it will be put a helmet on your head. But I kind of refuse to think that that's the only opportunity that we have. What I prefer to do is talk about safe cycling, and helmet use, along with many other things, is part of that approach. And as we move through our educational approaches, it's important to let folks know that wearing a helmet decreases the severity of crash. It communicates your intentions to be a good, safe rider to those around you, and kind of move forward with that approach.
All right, our next question asks, what can a pedestrian do if they are already in the crosswalk and realize that the vehicle coming toward them is not going to stop? Is there training that you can provide to pedestrians on how to deal with a possible collision?
Yeah, I mean, your first line of defense is always to assess the gap in traffic, to make sure that it's sufficient that you don't get into that situation, to communicate with the motorist via your body position, whether it's being right up at the edge of the crosswalk, turning and facing the motorist, making eye contact, possibly extending an arm to more clearly communicate your intention. I mean, that's where you're going to have the best chances of setting up a safe crossing opportunity. Then as you're going through the crosswalk, I'm astounded by the number of people that once they enter a crosswalk just make the assumption that it's safe to go. And they'll, like the woman in the slide, be walking with something that's obstructing their view in one direction, or they'll be talking on their cell phone or paying attention, playing with their BlackBerry, all things which do not give them good clues about approaching vehicles. So it's definitely important when crossing in a crosswalk that you continually scan back and forth. I refer to it as keeping your head on a swivel, that you really want to do that. And, then the cop in me, when I'm teaching these things, people always laugh at me because apparently I cross the street like a cop. And that means that when I engage the motorist in eye contact, the message that I'm sending when I'm looking at them is, you will stop, right? Because we have to do that. And I'm looking for clues and cues that they see me, whether it's the motorist, slowing down at a sufficient distance, whether it's the motorist waving me through. If I'm not seeing those things, I'm not going to step in front of that car. Once you're committed, I suppose your best defense is going to be good martial arts training, so your perception reaction time hopefully gets you out of the way. But an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Great. We have about 10 more minutes for questions, so I'm going to roll through as many as I can. What are the most important laws that could be changed to support pedestrians and make walking or biking safer and more convenient?
I think the first thing that I want to say is that I think in most cases, in most communities, in most states, our pedestrian laws and motor vehicle laws do a pretty good job of establishing rules that should allow pedestrians to safely cross the street. So I think the first thing that I would like to see addressed is, more education, so that that our pedestrians and our motorists know what the law is, more education for our law enforcement officers so that they know what the law is and that they know the reason for the law, so that they're more willing to engage in enforcement activity, which will, raise the level of compliance. So I think that would be definitely the first place that I would suggest that we start. But simultaneously, we can look at our laws. One of the ones that I mentioned before is that some states require motorists to stop for a pedestrian in a crosswalk. And I think that delivers a much clearer message. It's easier for motorists to comply. It's easier for pedestrians to judge a motorist's intention, and it's easier for law enforcement officers to enforce than in states where we have a yield requirement which may be vague for all of those parties.
What do you think of ticketing that requires the recipient to attend safety training?
Yeah, I like it. I mean, I'm a firm believer in using the lowest level of enforcement necessary to obtain, the required results. If I can say to somebody, hey, would you please cross over at the crosswalk? We've had, a number of injuries and close calls here mid-block. That would be a good thing. It's probably a bad example because jaywalking may not be an enforcement problem, but you can see where I'm going. The oral warning the written warning raises the ante a little bit. I actually like written warning scenarios where I could write a violator a written warning, but it would go into a database. So if one of my partners were to stop somebody for the same violation later, it would come up in the system, and my partner would know that that person already had their freebie and wasn't quite getting with the program, and it would result in a citation. Certainly, severe violations, require some kind of elevated action, and if the officer has the opportunity to refer somebody to a diversion program, is what we would call that, where they would get education instead of a citation. I'm a big believer in that. I find law enforcement officers who might be reluctant to issue somebody a citation and then normally would only have a written warning as an option might be more likely to refer somebody into a diversion program to get them some education. So I think it's a great option if we have it.
What communities do excellent ped bike officer training? Are there pre-canned officer training materials out there?
There are a couple of programs that are out there, a number of which I've worked on. NHTSA has a program, Community Bicycle Safety for Law Enforcement. Wisconsin has a program. It's called Pedestrian and Bicycle Law Enforcement Training. The state of Louisiana has an Enforcement for Pedestrian and Bicycle Safety course. And I know that there are also programs in Florida, and there may be programs in other states that are slipping my mind right now.
Okay. How can you reduce bike and pedestrian conflicts when bikes and pedestrians share a multi-use path?
I think the thing that you need to look at is typically speed differential that gets us into difficulty. And that's whether it's pedestrians and bicyclists or bicyclists and motorists. When the speed is, within 15 miles per hour, give or take a little, all parties tend to have enough time to react and respond appropriately. It's when we start to get elevated speeds that we really start to create dangerous situations. So if we're talking about multi-use paths where you might have somebody, using a walker or walking a dog or pushing a baby stroller, they're probably going, a mile, 2 miles per hour, 3 or 4 miles per hour. You may have a runner there also. If you've got a bicyclist that's operating, at or below pedestrian speed, we just typically don't have problems. It works out just fine. But as the speed of that bicyclist increases, especially beyond 15 miles per hour, then we start to have more difficulties. If the bicyclist, gives an audible warning, whether it's a bell or a voice command passing on your left, there's just less time for the pedestrian to hear it and to react to it. Pedestrians don't always react in predictable ways. They may step right instead of left. My wife had a situation on a recreational trail in Minneapolis one time where there was an older couple holding hands walking in front of her. Tracy rode up behind them on her bike and said, "Excuse me, passing on your left." The woman stepped to the left, the man stepped to the right, and they were still holding hands. Well, Tracy was going 2-3 miles per hour at that point and just stopped. But just kind of illustrates the difficulty we have and how excessive speed on the part of bicyclists on multi-use trails can really create some conflict.
Okay, we have time for about 2 more questions. How do you deal with motorists who are turning right and only look to the left without looking or seeing the pedestrian?
If you're asking me how I feel about them, I'm not happy with them at all. Typically what happens, again, I mentioned earlier, because of the complexities of traffic, because motorists are distracted, they tend to select out the parts of the traffic environment that are not a threat to them. And realistically, the only threat to a motorist in the traffic environment is another motor vehicle. And for better or worse, motorists tend to develop lazy habits that only require them to look for, the biggest threats to their, to themselves while they're moving, down the street or through an intersection. What motorists are supposed to do, we all know this, is when they approach an intersection, they're supposed to look left, right, left again, look to all quadrants of the intersection for anything that could be dangerous, whether it's a motorist, a pedestrian, or a bicyclist. But because we get lazy and because the only threat to a right-turning motorist is somebody approaching from their left, typically what motorists will do is they will only scan to their left and then make the right turn. And the crash reports that I've seen with those types of collisions, it's very common for the motorist to say, I never saw the pedestrian. And they're not lying. But the problem is the reason they didn't see the pedestrian is because they didn't look. So anything that we can do from an engineering standpoint to make the pedestrian more visible, to slow the speeds of the turning motorists, those are helpful. It's important to educate motorists that pedestrians they should expect them in traffic environment and that they may very well be required to yield to them. And we need to train the pedestrians on what the common mistakes are that motorists make. I know that motorists typically don't look to their right when going through an intersection, so I'm looking to make eye contact with that motorist. If I don't make eye contact with that motorist, I typically will not step out into that crosswalk.
Thank you, Peter. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for discussion today. If we did not get to your question, we will be addressing all of the submitted questions and posting them to the webinar page on our website. Once again, a recording and transcript of today's program, as well as a PDF copy of the slide presentation, will be available in about a week at walkinginfo.org/webinars. Finally, I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar has ended. Again, we very much appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. Thank you again to our speaker, Peter Flucke, and thanks to all of you for attending today's PBIC, NHTSA, and Federal Highway Administration Designing for Pedestrian Safety Action Plan webinar series. Thank you and have a great day.